thank you everybody for being here. So welcome back to a new lecture about our course of markets and his critics. I'm delighted today to introduce Andrej Svorenčík. Sorry for my pronunciation of your last name. Andrej is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. He obtained his PhD at the University of Utrecht, and his research is mainly on the economic history of the post-war period in the 20th century. So let's start, Andrej.
Thank you, Ivan. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Let me start by sharing my slides. Can you see the slides? Perfect. I'm sorry, I just encountered the same problem as we had in a testing run. So let me just restart sharing the screen again.
Maybe instead of full screen mode, you just do read mode. Oh, that looks nice.
Precisely, yeah. I will just do that.
That looks good.
Cool. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So welcome everyone to the 6th lecture in this course about markets and their critics. In the first 5 weeks, we covered the various aspects of markets. And in today's lecture, I'd like to talk about a related topic, alternatives to markets that have been proposed over the past several centuries. And I'll cover a few topics like utopian and scientific socialism. I'll discuss the crucial socialist calculation debate of the 1920s and 1930s. I look at some practice of socialism and market planning or market socialism, and we'll discuss also the future of market socialism. On Thursday, there will be a lecture by an expert. She will complement some of the topics that are covered today. So I might skip a particular topic, especially about market planning in Soviet Union. But let me start with utopian socialism, as it's the oldest, or let me actually start with defining socialism as a system of social organization in which private property and distribution of income are subject to social control. And what social control means has been debated for a long time, and there is a whole spectrum of ideas about the extent and the kind of property that society should own or control, but also the way in which society should exercise its control over the property and other resources. Socialism is not only this type of social organization, but it's also an umbrella term for various political movements that have been attempting to put this system into practice. And the first term was used to describe, the term was first used to describe various doctrines by late 18th century and early 19th century political thinkers, economists, and sociologists like Charles Fourier, Henri Saint-Simon, and Robert Owen, who emphasize a non-coercive communities of people working together in a non-competitive way for the well-being, physical or spiritual, or both, of all people involved. And this has been labeled as utopian socialism. The opposite of that, the scientific socialism, has been used by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who saw socialism as a transition between capitalism and communism. And both Engels and Marx took some elements of previous utopian socialism, which I will expound in much detail in the following slides, and also try to distance themselves from previous proposals that have been made, and they're what they call scientific socialism. So I will try to explain the difference between utopian and scientific socialism in my first part of the lecture. But with this definition of socialism, about control of private property and distribution of income, provides a basic framework to understand the various alternatives to markets that have been proposed over the past few centuries. The first person to actually use the word utopia, but not the word utopian socialism. It was the phrase utopian socialism was coined, exposed by Marx and Engels in the second half of the 19th century, was Sir Thomas More, who lived in the first half of the 16th century, and he was an English humanist and a statesman, and eventually a chancellor of England, who met a dire fate by being beheaded for refusing to accept King Henry VIII as the head of the Church of England. That's the king who had multiple wives and wanted to divorce them, and for various reasons he created the Church of England. But before he became Chancellor of England, he was appointed to a delegation to revise the Anglo-Flemish Commercial Treaty and travel to the Flemish cities, especially Bruges and others, which were the emerging centers of capitalism and trade in Renaissance Europe. And as a result, he published a treatise called Utopia in 1516, which was an immediate success. And he coined the word utopia as a mixture of Greek names referring to utopos as a good place, turning it into otopos as a no place. And what he described in his treatise from 1516 was as a country, an island that was living in what we would call, by contemporary word, utopia. It was a satirical essay in which he described a world where there is total religious toleration and freedom. But besides this religious theological component, he had also an economic component. In his envisioned commonwealth or envisioned island state, all people would be working according to their abilities and consume according to their needs, a phrase that had lots of currency in the 20th century in various attempts to establish communism or socialism in large parts of the world. And in his utopia, there was no poverty. There would be free education, not only to men, but also to women. He advocated communal and not private ownership. Private ownership was a source of ill in the society, and communal ownership would be a way of controlling the sins of pride, envy, and greed. He essentially established a new literary genre of utopian treatises, and many followed. One of the most famous ones was written by Tommaso Campanella, who lived almost a century later. And in his well-known work, The City of the Sun from 1602, he described his own version of a commonwealth, ideal commonwealth, which was to be governed by enlightened men by reason and who would be of equal dignity, with every man's work designed to contribute to the good of the community. Private property, like in More's Utopia, was the ultimate source of ill in the society. Undue wealth and poverty in his envisioned City of the Sun would be non-existent, because every man would be permitted not more than he needed. Both Campanella and More had a substantive theological component to their work, but they were reflecting also on the emerging commercial, mercantile, capitalist society of the 16th, 17th century. With the French Revolution and with the advances in technology, but also transition to industrial revolution, many contemporaries of the French Revolution started thinking about a new way of reorganizing the society. And one of the most prolific writers in this regard was Andrej de Saint-Simon from the late 18th, early 20th, late 18th, early 19th century. And what he, as a social theorist, political thinker, but also economist and sociologist, thought and foresaw was that industrialization of the world is coming. And what he believed as the solution to any human problem would be belief in science and technology. And what he called for was also social and economic planning in this endeavor. What he thought was that scientists could replace priests as the key people in holding a society together. And he recognized that the needs of the working class had to be fulfilled in order to have an effective or an efficient economy. Without the incorporation of the working class with the bourgeoisie, such a society could not appear. Furthermore, he had a very special view of history. What he had in mind was that he was not against private ownership of productive property. So he was not calling for abandoning, for establishing of public ownership of all productive property. But he advocated public control of property through central planning, where the scientists, but also industrialists and engineers would be key people in directing the energies of society to meet those needs of the society. And this would not only be more efficient than capitalism, but also it would be an inevitable feature of the history. Because in Saint-Simon's perception of history, history moves through a series of stages. Each is marked by a particular arrangement of social classes and a set of dominant beliefs. And these social classes clash, and the result of the clash leads to a new arrangement of the social classes, a new set of dominant beliefs. So, for instance, feudalism, with its aristocracy and monotheistic religion like Catholicism or Protestantism, had to give way to industrialism or capitalism with reliance on science, reason, and division of labor. Therefore, for Saint-Simon, it made sense to put the economic arrangements of society in the hands of the most knowledgeable and productive members, so that they may direct economic production for the benefit of all. His followers, Saint-Simonians, eventually were more radical. They wanted to abandon private ownership. They were advocating for public ownership, but they didn't have the resources or did not implement such radical ideas completely. A person who came closer to realization of his ideas was another French social theorist and philosopher, François-Marie Charles Fourier. And he claimed that modern society breeds selfishness, deception, and other evils because institutions, and that's very fascinating what he claimed, marriage and male-dominated family, and he put on equal footing, competitive markets, confine people to repetitive labor and a limited role in life, which frustrates the need for variety, which was important for Fourier. And by setting people against each other, by competing for profits, market in particular frustrates this harmony that was desirable. What he envisioned, unlike Saint-Simon or Moore or Campanella, was a type of society that would be more in keeping with human needs and desires, which he called phalanstery. And his phalanx proposal was essentially creating a series or a set of small self-sufficient communities of around 1,600 people who were organized according to principle of so-called attractive labor. That is, labor that will hold people, that people will work voluntarily. That's why it's attractive and happily, especially if that type of work engages their talents and interest. So the well-being of workers and well-being of people and also their satisfaction was key and important in this type of utopian proposal. because tasks become tiresome. Whether it's working in a manufacturer or factory, diversity or variety helps battle tiredness. So each member in his proposed phalanstery would have several occupations, moving from one to another depending on the interests that they as they evolved and changed. However, Fourier left room for private investment in his phalanx communities, but the shares in the ownership or profits of the ownership of private investment had to be redistributed, so that inequality of wealth had to be limited, though permitted. The last person I'd like to introduce as an utopian socialist went the furthest in terms of applying his proposals to practice. And it was a British or English social reformer and industrialist who was also a philanthropist and very early supporter of labor unions, Robert Owen, living in the late 18th century and the first half of the 19th century. He became a very wealthy industrialist by embarking on creating the Lanark cotton mill in Scotland. It was not only highly profitable, but it was very, very unlike any other factory or mill in England or United Kingdom, because of the standards that he introduced were remarkably humane and innovative in terms of social industrial welfare programs, improved housing, provision of education, limited number of hours, very good hourly pay. What he was interested in his philanthropic but also social reforms was to create very good working conditions and very good in terms of the contemporary standards. Working 10 or 12 hours was exceptional in his factory, in his mill. And what was also key for him was educating young people, young children. He did not allow any child labor up to 10 years of age, which was quite common in England. Any Dickensian novel would describe how children toiled in factories, and that was not possible in his cotton mill. And the reason was that he believed that it's nurturing and not nature that wholly determines one's character. So the character can be fully formed by one's environment, and education in that regard is super important. With the success of the Lanark mill becoming not only wealthy, he also embarked on a creation of a series or supporting of series of experimental utopian communities with overnights, not only in Britain, but also in the US. Unfortunately, most of them were short-lived. The most famous one was New Harmony in Indiana, which lasted from 1825 to 1828, which was a cooperative community, or at least it was supposed to be a cooperative community, with plans for humanity's salvation through rational thinking, cooperation, and free education. It was supposed to be self-sufficient, and all property was supposed to be owned commonly. About 1,000 people responded to his public appeal and joined the New Harmony in Indiana. However, most were misfits, ate his rations, and did not manage to keep the cooperative community self-sufficient. Most of the farms and workshops lay idle, and essentially anarchy prevailed. Owen lost 80% of his wealth in this experiment, and discouraged, he returned to England and died a couple of decades later. Nevertheless, all these proposals, especially of the last three, Fourier, Saint-Simon, and Owen, were very popular and provided a key component or key influence to scientific socialism, which is associated foremostly with Karl Marx, but also with his friend Friedrich Engels, as depicted here. And Marx, of course, is the most important theorist of socialism. And both Engels and Marx created the label utopian socialism as a derogatory term to contrast what Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Owen tried to depict and create. And they try to contrast it with their own scientific approach to socialism. And I'll explain or tease out some of the meanings of what it meant so scientific to Marx and Engels. For Marx and Engels, the path to socialism proceeds through the establishment of, does not proceed through the establishment of model communities like Owen did or Saint-Simon and Fourier proposed. That set examples of harmonious cooperation to the world, and eventually would snowball into the whole world turning into this ideal state of nature, but evolves through clash of social classes. And in the Manifesto of the Communist Party from 1848, which is one of the most would argue the most principled programmatic statement of socialist in socialist and communist parties in 19th and even in the early 20th century, was that history of all hitherto existing society is a history of class struggles. And this idea of class struggles, this key notion was the basis of the scientific understanding of history, not of economics, but of economics as well. But the scientific understanding of history inevitably leads to the culmination and the triumph of the working class and the establishment of socialism. So how did they reach this conclusion? How did Marx reach this conclusion? Well, he based his observations on what is being termed as historical materialism. It was inspired by the prevailing philosophical concept of the time of Georg Friedrich Hegel and his concept of dialectics, according to which ideas progress through the opposition of a thesis and an antithesis. And once these two clash, and synthesis emerges. And what Marx did was, in fact, he applied this concept not to ideas, but to the material world and the evolution of society. So what Marx offered was a historical analysis of epochs based on their level of technology and organization, which divided the human history into eras of slavery, which was replaced by serfdom, and which was eventually replaced by wage labor or capitalist societies in which both Marx and Engels were living in the 19th century. And the transition from one to another was a result of historical tensions that were inherent to each of the era. And the outcomes was a new higher stage of a society. And the inherent failings of the capitalist society would eventually lead first to socialism and eventually to communism, the highest stage of what Marx considered as a state of society where all ownership would be communal and there would be no class conflict. And with no class conflict available, there would not be any clash and eventually no new type of a society. So that would be the end of a history, essentially. And Marx was not only a theoretician of history or a sociologist, but also an economist. And he provided a very thorough critique of the 19th century capitalism, which was based on how the capitalist society or capitalist modes of production operate in a society, in a capitalist society. And according to Marx, capitalism is both progressive force in history in the sense that it will evolve it transplants the sort of aristocratic feudalistic society by making possible industrial transformation of the world, which unleashes all the productive powers to free everyone from essentially working for their sustenance. But also it's an exploitative system that alienates, and that's a very key concept of Marxism, alienates capitalists and workers from their true humanity, which will be reached or attained once the society moves to communism. And this exploitative nature of capitalism condemns the working classes, the proletariat, who own nothing but their labor power, to lives of grinding labor, while the capitalists reap all the profits, all the surplus value, as he coined it. The oeuvre of Marx is extremely broad, and he had lots of contributions. And in this very short overview, I'm focusing mostly on the idea of the alternative to the market as he proposed it in the sense once the society reaches socialism and communism. And I will have to disregard a lot of the other concepts that he introduced. But one of the inevitable results of his materialistic conception of history was that there will be a war between the proletariat, the working class, and the capitalists, which will end all the class divisions. Because something that is inherently built into capitalism were depressions and recessions and a lot of competition for jobs, and workers would eventually realize that they form a class. Their class consciousness would be established as proletariat. And once they realize that they are oppressed and exploited by the bourgeoisie or the capitalist class, they would, with this new awareness, overthrow the bourgeoisie. For a series either of spontaneous uprisings or through seizing eventually the control of the government. With a large work of Marx, he provides multiple ideas how this could happen, and the natural place for such as a socialist revolution would be the most developed capitalist societies or countries like England or Germany or perhaps the United States. But he also suggested that even countries like the Russian Empire, which was essentially a feudalist society, would be able to skip capitalism through a revolution, while, for instance, England or Germany could transition to it more peacefully. Both Marx and Engels, and Engels was essentially the key interpreter of Marx after he died, and also the publisher and long-term supporter of Marx, they never really elaborated how the institutions of socialism and communism would actually operate and look like, how the processes of ownership of all the modes of production would look like, and how the decisions would be made. However, there would be no place for valuations, and it would be replaced by calculations in terms of natural or physical units. So money would become superfluous, and resource allocation or distribution and production would be considered technical affairs to be undertaken by engineers and technical specialists. And this is a key element that will become crucial for the story that I'm trying to describe for the 20th century. This emphasis on reducing the economic decision making about scarcity and finding the best solutions for the limited means would be a technical issue. So what actually happened, and this is something that I'll provide a very quick overview because it's my understanding that we will get a much thorough description of this on Thursday, was that with the World War I and the upheaval created and lots of empires falling apart, like German Empire turning into a republic, the Weimar Republic, Austria-Hungary dissolving into multiple states, and various attempts to create socialist revolutions, whether in Germany or Hungary and other places. The most successful one took place in Tsarist Russia, where Lenin in 1917 is able to seize power and overthrow the Tsarist Romanovs dynasty and establish the dictatorship of the Bolsheviks. And throughout the period of the Russian Civil War, where they tried to take control of entire Tsarist Russia, which would be relabeled as Soviet Union, they started implementing various measures that Lenin and others believed were the way of reaching socialism in the Soviet Union, and believing that the socialist revolution would eventually catch on the entire world. So what they were introducing was a complete expropriation of private businesses. Industry would be nationalized, a centralized planning would be established, and any surplus of food, especially of grain, would be requisitioned from peasantry by the state. And this was the period of civil war or war communism from 1918 to 1920, the early years when they tried to consolidate the power, which had tremendously bad consequences on the state of the economy in Russia. Crops, first and foremost, because of not being able to retain surplus, would plummet, as peasants would have no incentive to produce more than they needed. Labor productivity and industrial output plummeted because the newly nationalized and centralized industries didn't have any managers. There would be a new class of sort of state-appointed managers with little training, little experience. And with all this decline in economic activity, starvation would prevail, especially in cities, which had no access to produce of the rural areas. Having centralized power and essentially won the Russian Civil War, and realizing the disastrous effects of the war communist economic policies, Lenin and other Bolsheviks implemented the so-called New Economic Policy, NEP, and that governed Soviet Union. Was a key economic policy from 1921 through 1928, which was a temporary retreat from the extreme centralization and essentially a doctrinaire interpretation of Marx and Engels. What they allowed was essentially for peasants to keep certain surplus, but they set prices for buying off the rest. They allowed companies for more decentralized planning, which helped for the economy to rebound in part. With Lenin's death in 1924 and Stalin taking over, essentially he introduced a new period of forced collectivization and industrialization in the period, especially of 1929 to 1933, which was essentially a policy of turning traditional agriculture, which would be small family-run farms, often on land that was owned by large, rich aristocrats, into a state-owned system of collective farming with extremely large farms called kolkhozes, with thousands, if not more, farmers working and toiling on them. And the emphasis on industrialization, sort of trying to catch up with the other parts of Europe and the world, led to a tremendous increase, or turning the Soviet Union into an industrial nation, with tripling essentially the number of workers in industry and construction and transport, and also the implementation of the first 5-year plan, 1928 through 1933. More details should follow on Thursday, and how this was established and how it was done. However, the First World War did not only have impact on essentially creating the first socialist country in the world, the Soviet Union, but also had tremendous implications for economic thought about markets and alternatives of them. And this is summarily labeled as the socialist calculation debate of the 1920s and 1930s. And essentially the catalyst of this debate was Otto Neurath. And Otto Neurath is a famous philosopher, but also a political economist, born in Vienna, but who spent large parts of the World War I as an administrator in Germany, and also as a theoretician of wartime economies, receiving habilitation on this topic in 1917. And what he argued was that during peacetime, the production in market economies is driven by profits. So market economies are profit-based, but this leads to the well-known periods of overproduction and unemployment, booms and busts. However, in wartime, especially, and that was quite visible to everyone during World War I, when all economies, whether it was Allies or or the opponents were trying to steer the war effort and turn the effective capacity of the country for the war effort, and there would be all the capacity would be utilized fully. What also happened was there would be price system would be suppressed. There would be lots of price ceilings and quantity controls for various less desired goods, because what was the priority were guns and things needed for the war effort. So and the price system would be essentially replaced by extensive planning of materials from the governmental center. And so what he proposed was that wartime planning could and should continue in peacetime. And for that, national accounting center would have to be set up to run the economy as essentially one giant enterprise. This one giant enterprise idea will be echoed a century later, which I will come towards the end of the lecture. And this would help to alleviate the problems of overproduction, unemployment. It would be more efficient, and I'm using the word efficient in sort of very loose colloquial sense. Would create a system, planning economy that would be superior to market-based economies. This proposal from that was published shortly after the World War I was picked up by Ludwig von Mises, a famous so-called Austrian economist, libertarian economist, who didn't really like Neurath as a person, but also the ideas that he proposed. And in his German treatise and economic calculation, the Socialist Commonwealth from 1920, he set out not only to rebuff Neurath's arguments, but also to undertake a more general arguments against socialist planning and socialist economies. So Mises took as a starting point that in socialism, or at least in most forms of socialism, factors of production are owned by the state, and there is no market for them. And with that, any socialist manager has no way to tell when choosing among a huge array of technologically feasible input combinations, and which of them are economically feasible. So essentially, the managers would be groping in the dark, or to quote from Mises' response is to quote, where there is no free market, there is no pricing mechanism. And without a pricing mechanism, there is no economic calculation. And this idea that without a pricing mechanism, there is no economic calculation was picked up by a number of market socialists, whether it was H.D. Dickinson, Oscar Lange, or Fred Taylor, and they received the label of market socialist. And the reason why they received this label was that they argued that it was actually possible to design an economy that was socialist in the sense, and I'm coming back to my very first slide, but what is socialism? The socialism in the sense that state owned the means of production, but also in which there would be markets for consumer goods and labor. So they make a modification, what is publicly owned and what would be privately preserved. And so in the absence of prices, what Mises was claiming, people would not know how to economize, because there would be no real balance between costs and benefits and alternative activities. So opportunity costs would not be able to be calculated. What they countered was that rational calculation in socialism or under socialism would still be theoretically possible, because any economy could be represented by a set of Walrasian system of equations. So this general equilibrium situation that Walras depicted in the late 19th century and in the mid 20th century was theoretically proven under a very set of restricted assumptions. What they claim is that this set of equations that represents the entire economy could be replicated in the socialist system and solved by planning authorities in a socialist system. And the way how to do that was directly proposed by Oskar Lange. And here is a photo of him, and there was supposed to be a photo of Friedrich von Hayek, who would be his main opponent. And what the blueprint that Lange proposed in 1936 in his blueprint for market socialism had several stages. What Lange proposed was that in a market socialism, there would still be a market for consumer goods, and there would be also a labor market. These two markets would stay the same as in a capitalist market. However, the productive sector would still be retained by the state, by the government, who would provide production guidelines to companies, to firms, and essentially they would force managers that they must price their products equal to the marginal costs and produce the optimal level of output that would minimize the average cost, which are the conditions of a competitive equilibrium. And any adjustments, because it would not be obvious that managers and the state would be able to hit the equilibrium right away, there would be a place for adjustments through trial and error, using inventory in the companies. If there is more, if there is substantial inventory, then there would be a price signal towards to lower the price so the inventory goes, but also to change the output. So that could be used as a signal. And in short, with these production guidelines and this type of mixing markets and state intervention, state planning, would ensure that efficiency of a competitive market would be achieved in a setting of a state ownership of all the means of production. And the process would essentially be equivalent to a Walrasian Tautonomant process. Excuse me. The most forceful rebuttal of Hayek, of Lange, appeared in Hayek in a series of articles that appeared in the second half of the 1930s, and eventually it culminated in 1944 in his Road to Serfdom, and 1946 about the role of information in a society, and a number of other articles and books. What Hayek argued was that what market socialists actually achieved was something different than they thought. They had not shown that rational calculations would be possible in socialism. They only shown that under very strict assumptions, with complete knowledge and of all the relevant data about consumer tastes and technical possibilities and everything that the market contains and produces, only then they would be able to solve a set of equations to determine the goods that should be produced in the quantities and prices. However, that is not enough. According to Hayek, this would not solve the problem of efficiency and how this could be achieved in socialism, because in a real-world economy, full information is absolutely not present, and the technical conditions of productions do not exist. What does exist are engineers with techniques that enable them to discover, or not just engineers, but also entrepreneurs who discover new solutions when confronted with various economic problems. So the knowledge needed by socialist planners to calculate the equations is not present, and it's only produced through the market discovery, which would be absent in a market socialist setting. Put differently, according to Hayek, socialism is not just not a computational problem. It is about the lack of generating the information required for the system to actually operate. The market socialist, by taking these technical conditions as given, what Lange was proposing as sort of is essentially assuming the entire problem of market economy away. And I continued his assault on market socialism further. He raised, for instance, the issue of equilibrium. Well, what the market socialists assumed was that they can that prices can be calculated by solving a set of simultaneous equations for the equilibrium. But the real economy is actually never in equilibrium. The disequilibrium state is what characterizes market economies. And its prices are essentially a key way of conveying information, which in market socialist settings would not be available to the centralized planners or decision makers. And only competition was the way of sort of providing, gearing the economy towards equilibrium, but also producing the information, localized, decentralized information that was needed. In Road to Serfdom, which a book that I'm not able to fully cover in this presentation, he pushes the argument further, contradicting Karl Mannheimer on that planning itself is a step towards a totalitarian state, and that the space of planning is unavailable. So, how did socialism look in practice? Most economists agree that Hayek won the socialist calculation debate, and he effectively shown that market socialism faces some inherent problems in its operation. So, how did socialist practice look like? Let me skip 1989. When Boris Yeltsin, not yet the president of the Soviet Russian Federation, but still an important high-ranking member of the Communist Party, visits the Space Center, Johnson Space Center in Texas, and he makes a detour to a supermarket, where to his amazement, he even had to ask whether this is stage, like a Potemkin village, where the variety of goods, the quantity and variety of goods available was astonishing, and that even as recounted in his biographies, who claimed that such a variety and quantity would not be available even to highest-ranking Communist Party members in the Soviet Union. And he even claimed that if the average Russian citizen would know how much different the situation is in the capitalist West, it would lead to a revolution. And what I would recommend you to watch is this very short 20-minute long video in the Czech television archives about the consequences of socialist economy, which is a series of short reportages about the various shortages experienced in my native Czechoslovakia in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. For instance, you will see there would be regular periods of various goods being unavailable, like toilet paper, menstruation pads. Surprisingly, in summer, there would be a shortage of swimming suits, which would arrive then in the winter. And in the winter, they would not have enough Christmas trees, and almost all people would have to wait in queues and lines to get goods that were in short supply. And often, once it would be their turn, the goods that they were desiring would not be available, and they had to buy something else. My own recollection from the late 1980s was waiting in line with my sister for bananas, and by the time we reached the beginning of the queue, it was our turn. There were no more bananas available, so we were allowed to buy a kilogram of grapefruits instead. And so this video is a real compilation of rare instances where actually state television reported about these shortages, and it's a quite remarkable video. And economists in the socialist East were theorizing what they were observing. There were multiple attempts to make the socialist planning better. And one of the key person, a critic, but also a proponent, was János Kornai, who died recently. And in his book, Economics of Shortage, a classic, published in 1979 or 1980, he analyzed and described the state of the economy that was experienced by most people in the East. And what he described is that socialist economies are essentially shortage economies. He coins this term, shortage economy, to describe these frequent, intensive, and chronic shortages that are pervasive and present. And they were not a result of some errors of central planners, but rather it was systemic and inherent to the socialist economies. For instance, government-enforced price ceilings were causing imbalances of demand and supply. For instance, the bananas that I was referring to were super cheap, but there was not enough of them. So people had to queue and you could not get them most of the time. The case of missing Christmas trees or missing seasonal clothes like swimming suits was because there was mistiming of production. And you don't need swimming suits when they arrive in September, or Christmas trees in January. So queuing and waiting list was a common feature of socialist economies. The high surge costs, essentially, at the expense of one's labor. The running joke used to be that people seeing a queue would just start queuing themselves, not even knowing what is being offered, because if they managed to get it, they would be able to exchange it for something else. So turning into or capitalizing on informal networks, on barter, on extended family, and the economy of exchanging favors and carrying favors was a typical feature that you will see exemplified in this video that I promoted in the previous slide. So what is also another feature of shortage economies was that planners were often blaming consumers, demanding the wrong things, that the plan was good, except that the consumers were behaving in a capitalist manner. They were demanding more than they would actually just need. And one of the key concepts and one of the key reasons why socialist planning was failing in practice was there was absence of bankruptcy rules. Companies could not go bankrupt, essentially. There would be a so-called soft budget constraint. Whatever would happen, the central government would have to bail out the producers, and the producers knew it and understood it. Therefore, they were trying to meet the plan, but nothing else. For instance, if the plan prescribed to create 1 million tons of pins, and the plan did not specify what type of pins it were supposed to be, whether large or small or special type, the companies would not care. They would just produce the requested amount, not taking into account what consumers were interested in. Also, there would be issue of repressed inflation, and the price mechanism would be completely distorted, as Hayek was explaining half a century later. So there were multiple attempts and series of attempts to improve planning. Even the János Kornai, who decided to become an economist in the post-war period, he survived the Holocaust. He was an Hungarian Jewish economist who decided to become an economist once he read Marx's Das Kapital. And his early work was about improving planning through various technical tools. And it was not only him and economists in other Eastern European states, but also in Soviet Union. There would be a generation of economists, whether it's Grigor Feldman, then Kantorovich, who gets the Nobel Prize, or Vasil Leontiev, who gets a Nobel Prize but emigrates, who pioneered the idea that mathematical methods and computational power can actually implement central planning and improve central planning and circumvent the shortcomings that were so clearly described by eventually later by Kornai in the shortage economy. However, during Stalin's period, you remember a couple slides back when I described sort of a series of economic policies and ways of implementing economic planning in the Soviet Union after 1917. During Stalin reign of the 1930s, 1940s, nothing much is being done in terms of improving the computational and mathematical methods. And actually, Stalin was quite suspicious of planning, and it was in stark contrast to supremacy of politics over the economy and economics. And here we have Kantorovich and Leontiev depicted. In 1960s and 1970s, the situation changes, and there was a special research program by Vasil Nemchino, who was later tried to implement it by Viktor Glushkov, essentially what they tried to do is create a national automated system for computation and information processing, OGAS, which was essentially in using the modern language, a computer network that would allow the transmission of information from thousands of production units, and by production units meaning factories, to a center, which would then send back instructions in a way as long as proposal would be working back to these units. The center would be collecting information that otherwise would have to be collected by hand, or would be almost impossible to collect in real time. And this proposed internet, Soviet internet, did not realize because the costs were substantial, and there was serious opposition in various ministries and the various bureaucracies in Ministry of the Economy and Central Planning were opposed, or were at least afraid that they would lose their powers. And this book, How Not to Network a Nation, The Uneasy History of the Soviet Internet, is a perfect example of this technocratic attempts to improve planning through improved technology and computational power, but also circumventing the limited abilities of the interval period in terms of planning and computation. And here you have the Central Economic Mathematical Institute in Moscow, which has a Mobius ring attached to a mural on its building, representing various conditions for linear programming and optimization processes that were part of planning. Often, especially in the recent period, but also with the advances of AI, there has been a new surge in claims that market socialism could be actually implemented with the advances of computational power, but especially with artificial intelligence. For instance, Phillips and Rosporsky in their extremely well-written book, People's Republic of Walmart, come back to this idea that while Walmart as a company is bigger than most nations in the world, they operate annually in hundreds of billions in terms of revenue, and they do not need an internal market to make decisions. That is a centralized company which makes decisions as if replacing markets, and internally it works and could be used as a blueprint, as a foundation for socialism, if extended beyond the limits of Walmart, which is already bigger than most countries in terms of its economic output and activity. But also there has been a set of claims by journalists, but also entrepreneurs, and the data revolution, artificial intelligence can revive the idea of planned economy. Even some economists like Dard Atishmoglu, one of the most well-known economists nowadays, argued on Twitter that what if computational power of central planners improved tremendously? Would Hayek be happy with central planning? Jack Ma, the founder of the Alibaba Group, declared in 2016 that, and this is a very long quote, that over the 100 years, we have come to believe that the market economy is the best system. But in my opinion, there will be a significant change in the next 3 decades. Okay, so until the first half of the 21st century. And the planned economy will become increasingly big. And why, he asked? Because with all the access to all kinds of data, we may be able to find the invisible hand of the market. And essentially solving all the Eurasian equations is finding the invisible hand of the market. And the planned economy I'm talking about is not the same as the one used by the Soviet Union, he continues, or at the beginning of the founding of the People's Republic of China. The biggest difference between the market economy and planned economy is that the former has the invisible hand of market forces. In the era of big data, the abilities of human beings in obtaining and processing data are greater than you can imagine. And he's writing that in 2016, that's 6-7 years before artificial intelligence and ChatGPT and the like. With the help of artificial intelligence or multiple intelligence, our perception of the world will be elevated to a new level. And he concludes, as such, big data will make the market smarter, make it possible to plan and predict market forces so as to allow us to finally achieve planned economy. So is this time different, or is this time not different? To borrow a phrase related to economic crisis. Well, can technological advances in computation replace the competitive discovery process that plagues within the context of the market? This techno-socialism or digital socialism that Jack Ma and others are proposing, and actually Jack Ma is a cautionary case, at least in terms of how his company ended in terms of the political repressions by the Communist Party of China, and his withdrawal from Alibaba. So techno-socialism essentially represents a restatement of the old case for market socialism. It's essentially finding the solution to economic calculation as a computational problem, rather than fixing the issue of discovery of context-specific knowledge that entrepreneurs but also consumers experience, and it emerges as an emergent property of exchanging of property rights. An exchange of property right, essentially, you give away your money and you get some goods, but also producers give away their money in exchange for supplies that they turn into goods. And this exchange of property rights is what Hayek and others were claiming crucial to the idea. So without solving this issue of generating this context-specific knowledge that prices and markets create, I'm not completely sure that we are that market socialism is about to come. Obviously, predicting the future is impossible, but it might be it might be far more difficult, or it might require far more than just artificial intelligence to replace what the market is doing. But the result we shall see in the next decades, perhaps earlier, perhaps later, if this can be, if market socialism can be materialized through technology and replacing human activity. There are many things that could happen, but I see there might be a question related to this. So I'll skip this, and let me just conclude by giving you further suggestions for readings and references. For instance, the Roger Beckhouse's The Ordinary Business of Life is an amazing textbook of the history of economic thought, which is a very good treatment, or short treatment, of Marxism, and also the calculation debate. If you're looking for a detailed discussion of the calculation debate without having to read all the articles and books by proponents and the contrarians, then Bruce Caldwell's Hayek and Socialism from the Journal of Economic Literature, 1997, is a great way to start. To those who want to read about skeptics, or the skeptic's take about how artificial intelligence or techno-socialism cannot succeed, then Peter Bootke's and Rossellino Candela's 2023 article, The Feasibility of Techno-Socialism, or Jesus Fernandez Villaveras, Artificial Intelligence Can't Solve the Knowledge Problem, would be a good start. Those who want to understand more the what is going on in the real socialist economies, then understanding the soft budget constraint by Janusz Gornay, but also co-written by Eric Meskin and Gerard Roland from also Journal of Economic Literature is a great article. Those who would like to learn more about socialism, about then George Bernard Shaw's socialism entry in Encyclopedia Britannica, the 13th edition for 1926, is a great start, but also John Broomer's 1994 book about the future of socialism recasts many of the criticism from a socialism market's perspective, and is certainly worthwhile to read. So let me stop sharing here, and let me open up the discussion.
Thank you very much, Andre. So I think that you present a very good lecture, and we have general perspective about what socialism actually is. So we have now time for some questions. So please feel free to send us any question that you have. We have one that is maybe something that you already mentioned, that is about technological development, and if you see any possibility that all the improvement, all the progress that we have in areas like artificial intelligence eventually can solve the problem of prices posed by high. So you think that eventually all these technological improvements will reach the point that you can fix the price problem presented by Hayek?
So I guess you have in mind this question in the Q&A that I see here. Do you think it's possible to generate information through AI instead of prices solving Hayek's impossibility of socialism? I'm not sure whether, I don't think AI is enough. If the market discovery process can be somehow captured in real time, whether through our phones or through virtual reality, augmented reality, perhaps that could be done. But despite the tremendous improvements in AI, I'm somewhat skeptical. Would I bet money on this? I don't know. 30 years ago, I would be amazed to see a cell phone. So perhaps in 30 years' time, I'll be amazed by market socialism. That works.
Okay, so another question is, it seems like the aggregation of people in groups or in classes, say the working class, the professional class, is a precondition for the theoretical development of socialism. But the problem that so one can potentially see is that people have different identities. So people have maybe a religion, nationality, an occupation. So the question is how socialism select the specific characteristics that you need to use to aggregate people. So how in socialism you solve the problem of multiple identities, several characteristics, and how you say, okay, this is the main one that is the relevant for the aggregation in classes or in groups.
Are you referring to the economic aspects or the societal aspects of the differences?
Yeah, I mean, you can think that maybe a loyalty is related with your nationality, with your religion, but also with your occupation. But the thing is that, I mean, in general, people have different characteristics. So it's not just your occupation, but also maybe you are an employee, but at the same time, you are an owner of maybe in a small capital. So the point is that it would be very difficult to select just one specific characteristic and say, okay, I'm going to aggregate those peoples in a particular class or in a particular group. So it seems like in the development of the scientists, socialism, so it's fundamental to have classes.
Yes. So the description of a society from a class perspective is a key notion that Marx introduces And obviously there is a certain amount of reduction in establishing these sociological concepts in the social class. Obviously there is a lot of stratification within each class. You can have like middle class, upper middle class, lower middle class, etc., which have different socioeconomic characteristics, but also worldviews. And one of the key attempts when say in Soviet Union after the Socialist Revolution of 1917, but also in other countries that were taken over by socialist governments, was the attempt to create a new classless society where people would abandon these bourgeois relicts, that people would become more enlightened, and the vestiges of the previous societal arrangement of capitalism would be abandoned, either through education, but also forcefully by re-education, by putting, say, former factory owners into menial work, or in the worst case, sending them to gulags, or not allowing their children to enjoy education, and promoting education for working class children. So there was a substantial attempt to redesign the society and its social structure to get closer towards socialism or communism, where all would be equal. But Lenin had this specific idea of a short period of transition towards socialism, where drastic measures would have to be taken to uproot the existing societal order.
Thank you, Andrej. Another question is, to what extent is economic planning necessarily related to state coercion? So basically, you presenting during the lecture that there is a relationship between socialism, practicality, and totalitarianism, or basically a totalitarian regime or government. So can you please elaborate a little bit more in that relationship? So do you think that they are part of the same package?
Yes. So when you look at the utopian socialist, it's all voluntary. Especially when you look at Saint-Simon, Fourier, or in their social reforms or proposals, or implemented proposals, it's based on voluntary cooperation and engagement. When you move towards Marx and Engels and Marxism, the issue of societal clashes, or clashes amongst social classes, is an inherent feature of the history. So there's this sense of inevitability of a certain element of repression and clash. Marx and Engels were not clear-cut in terms of how the socialist economy would operate, the intricate details. So once Lenin takes over Soviet Union, they have to they invent many things on the go, and the transition to a new state was accompanied by a substantial amount of forceful changes. So when there is the war economy of 1918 through 1921 in Soviet Union, factory owners were not just voluntarily giving up their factories just because they realized socialism had arrived. It was all forceful. And similarly, peasants were not giving up their surplus produce. There might have been some exceptions, but most of them were unhappy with surrendering their surplus and endangering their livelihood. So eventually, the state coercion and planning become at least what Hayek eventually describes in his Road to Serfdom, essentially the same as two different sides of the same coin, that planning encourages totalitarian measures, because implementing the plan and getting everyone on board requires more or less of state coercion. And in the practice shows that the state coercion, whether it's whether it was in China or Soviet Union or Eastern European countries, was extremely coercive.
Thank you, Andrej. A final question would be, thinking in the future. So some people think that regardless the problems associated with socialism, eventually that economic system is inevitable. So some scholars, some thinkers in the past have predicted that socialism will arrive anyway, even with all the problems. So in your opinion, is there any reason to believe that socialism is inevitable? Like maybe some scholars and thinkers thought in the past.
Well, I think the best perspective on this inevitability conception of history is provided by Karl Popper and his sort of criterion what counts as scientific. And for Popper, scientific theories or claims are falsifiable, so they can potentially turn out to be wrong. For a Marxist conception of history, on the one hand, we know as of now that they have not succeeded, or the history has not turned into socialist or communist paradise yet. But the fact that it still could be makes it essentially irrefutable and very simplified. If I take it if my answer should be very simplistic. So a lot of problems with Marx's predictions are that the predictions are not testable. So the transition could take place through a variety of channels. Why hasn't the socialist economy arrived, say, in the most advanced economies like UK or the United States or Germany? That would be my answer, a short answer to that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Andrej. And thank you very much, everybody, for attending this lecture. We will continue on Thursday with our plenary session. Our speaker will be Professor Olesia Kirschik. She will continue talking on this topic. Thank you very much, and see you on Thursday.